Hello, everybody. We are very happy to have here Professor Paul Gootenberg from Stony Brook, who is going to talk about his latest book, and here, showing it to you, everybody, Andean Cocaine, the Making of a Global Drug. This is a great book, and I'm just giving you a few descriptions of the reviews that have come out. Eminently readable and fascinating, this tour de force illustrates how a fresh, insightful focus on a single commodity can illuminate economic development, political and social concerns, shifting ideologies, and cultural change, both locally and globally. Highly recommended. And another one, Unquestionable, the single most important volume on cocaine international history. And I'm going to leave it there. Professor Paul Gootenberg started with his first book, Between Silver and Guano, Commercial Policy in the State of Post-Independence Peru, where he really changed some of the paradigms in the way we understand 19th century Latin American history, particularly economic history. He continued with another book, Imagining Development, Economic Ideas in Peru's Fictitious Prosperity of Guano. And he has edited other books about social inequality and about cocaine. So with that, again, thank you for coming. We're very fortunate to have you here, and I give the floor to you. To the public, after his presentation, we'll have sessions of questions and answers. And I've been told that you need to speak to the microphone for those questions, so we'll arrange that.
You mean you take the microphone?
We will take the microphone.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you, Maritza, for that generous introduction. I'm delighted to be here in Cleveland, but it's also kind of fascinating to me that cocaine, which has so long been a subject of my research, seems to finally be breaking into the humanities, which is a whole new development for me. Okay. Today I'm going to talk to you not about the entire book, which I'm happy to plug here and to all the PBS viewers out there in across America. I'm not going to be talking to you about the entire book, Andean Cocaine, but I am going to be talking to you about a specific part of it, and it deals with the founders of the modern cocaine trades after World War II, precursors to the infamous Colombian cartels after the 1970s. So it's a topic that I sometimes refer to jokingly as the pre-Columbian origins of drug trafficking in the Americas. By way of context, let me just put it in the context of the book itself. This is an unknown chapter in cocaine's history from the 1940s to the 1970s, but it is just one episodic link in a much larger canvas of the aforementioned book, Andean Cocaine, The Making of a Global Drug, which came out with the University of North Carolina Press this year after more than a decade of research and writing. Now, the book itself analyzes cocaine's long birthing through three major processes. First, its construction as a heroic 19th century medical commodity. Second, cocaine's early 20th century fall from political and legal grace. And finally, what I'm going to be focusing on most here today, cocaine's resurrection as the defining Andean commodity or illicit commodity of the late 20th century. And I hope that the story that I tell here today illustrates two of the core innovations of the book itself, which is the stress on the global interconnectedness of drugs like cocaine, and its stress on the role of local protagonists, or what historians and social scientists love to call agency, in the making of these transnational flows. Those of you who haven't gotten these are handouts. Maybe some of you have never seen them before. They're what preceded PowerPoint, and the great advantage of handouts is that they always work. And you can scribble little notes and pictures on the back of them as well. Okay, so basically the topic I'm going to talk to you about today is the origins of the modern phenomena of illicit cocaine, a hidden chapter in the history of globalization itself. Cocaine is a drug commodity which virtually everybody knows about, which exploded in a huge global criminal enterprise in the 1970s through 1980s, continues today, associated in the public imagination with infamous Colombian cartels and legendary bad guys like Pablo Escobar, a drug that had blighting social consequences in the United States, especially with 1980s and crack cocaine, and which has united a costly and still ongoing war on drugs against the Andes, and to some extent today against Mexico as well. Yet, basically, we still have no idea who or what forces invented or organized this notorious trade in the first place. Yeah, what are we seeing there? Machu Picchu. I have a doctoral student who's writing a history of Machu Picchu, so art print. Okay. We were trying to get a map up there of South America, so. It was there. It was there. Okay, well, in any case. Because part of what I want to talk to you about today is really this kind of hemispheric geography of cocaine and how it emerged over time. This puzzle of who or what actually invented modern illicit cocaine, in fact, conceals what historians would conceive of as a specific historiographical problem or gap in the history of drugs, if I can use such a formal term when discussing such a nascent field as the history of drugs. Okay. That is to say, prior to the end of World War II, there is no evidence of any organized or transnational traffic in cocaine, unlike its sister drug, heroin, and despite the fact that for a long time people have known about the, say, recreational possibilities of cocaine. And prior to 1973, and that's actually a date that you might want to remember, Colombians, that is from the country mythically and sensationally associated with cocaine today, evinced no interest whatsoever in the drug. So the specific gap we need to fill in or explain in cocaine's construction as an illicit international drug is this period 1945 to 1973, or if you think about it in other terms, the first half of the Cold War. The period, and I'm going to give you a sneak preview here, when a new class of traffickers was born, composed of hundreds or thousands of anonymous, small-time Peruvians, Bolivians, and compatriots from Chile, Cuba, and across the Americas, as you see right there, actors who came together to build new corridors of drugs north that for the first time systematically linked the coca peasants of the Andes through chemists and smugglers to cocaine lovers, who were a whole new phenomena here in the United States. And these were groups that I discovered and tried to make sense of from hundreds of declassified documents that were liberated from the DEA in the course of writing the new global history of Andean cocaine. Interesting map. I wish it had less Canada and more South America, although the Canada could actually, you know, just think of it, there's all that snow up there anyway, so it kind of fits the topic today. All right, that's great. Fantastic. I like that. Okay, anyway, apart from sketching this kind of a new illicit circus and actors and geography of the post-war era, I also want to make two larger analytical points about the birth of these pre-Columbian narcos, points that may have some kind of political or other implications today. And first of these is that the rise and dispersion of cocaine was in large part a reaction to or shadow of U.S. actions in the post-war era to complete a global prohibitions regime around cocaine. That is, prior to the 1940s, cocaine still had legal spaces, especially in the Andes, that were then closed and repressed with the illicit consequences I'm going to draw out today. And second, and what was more surprising to me as I did my research, the shifting geography or opportunities for drugs were part of the political map of the Cold War in Latin America, tensions and pressures that were also exported by the United States in the region. So apart from the hidden and energetic roles of some colorful South American empresarios, the construction of modern cocaine was closely linked to North American policies and practices in Latin America. That is to say, in even broader terms, drugs have always been a very global or transnational phenomenon. Okay. Anyway, now that we have the map all set up, let me get down to what I want to present to you here today. Today's talk is, I'm going to give it in really two different sections. First, I want to do this descriptive tour of the emerging cocaine networks and geographies between 1945 and the 1970s. And then secondly, I want to go back and track this political analysis of the patterns that we find looking at the map. Now, in terms of geography, I'm going to start with Peru. You will see where Peru is up there, which is was the birthplace of illicit cocaine in the late 1940s. Then I'm going to move through a series of Pan-American corridors of the 1950s and 60s, and then I'm going to end on Bolivia, right there in the middle of South America, which was in the mid-1960s the place where a new and dynamic form of populist cocaine capitalism was born in the Americas. Okay. Well, let's start with Peru. It's a good place to start because it's actually, as Melissa said, the country that I've actually know quite a bit about. I've worked on it all of my scholarly career. But more than that, in Peru's eastern Amazonian region, the Montaña region, if I can actually step in here and show you sort of where we're talking about, this area here, where the Montaña is the area where the Andean mountains meet the Amazon jungle. And specifically, the region around the town of Huánuco and above what is the Huallaga Valley. I'm sure maybe a few of you have heard of the Huallaga Valley region. It was very famous during the 1980s, during the cocaine boom then. Peru's eastern Amazonia has had long historical ties to what was a perfectly legal and respectable national cocaine industry dating back to the 1880s. And this was the medical commodity cocaine, which was, some of you may have heard about this, was used as mainly for local anesthesia. In the late 19th century, it was derived from the local Andean coca leaf, and was marketed globally during this era by sophisticated global firms like Merck of Germany and Merck in the United States as well. In fact, Peru's turn-of-the-century cocaine industrialists invented and specialized in export of something that was called crude cocaine, or in Spanish it was sometimes called cocaína bruta, which is a valuable semi-refined sulfate coca paste that Merck and other foreign companies then went on to refine into powdered or cocaine hydrochloride, you know, the white powdered stuff that some of you may be familiar with here in the audience. Maybe you saw a little section on it in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I don't know. Not coincidentally, this crude cocaine is exactly the same jungle mix that is known today as pasta básica de cocaína, or PBC, which is the chief peasant input into today's massive global cocaine trade. Now, after World War II, this cradle of legal, modern cocaine rapidly transformed into its opposite, an underground source of illicit cocaine, or coke, as it was actually very quickly called. In 1947, the first clues began to emerge in a trickle of sailors smuggling it along grace line ships, just ounces stashed in their pockets, smuggling it all the way up to, usually to New York City. The likely root of this kind of trade was the final shrinkage of the prior legal markets for cocaine, like in the German pharmaceutical market, and the tightening of restrictions on the drug by now closely collaborating Peruvian and U.S. authorities. In 1948, U.S. drug agents began their first overseas anti-cocaine investigations and sting operations, reaching all the way from New York City down into the Huallaga region of Peru. And then in August 1949, very dramatically, you see the first international cocaine scandal, or scare, erupting around the so-called Balareso gang. You know, in your handouts right there, you've got this scary-looking dude there. That's him, a Peruvian sailor. The Balareso gang was run by Eduardo Balareso, who was a very enterprising Peruvian sailor, and it resulted in more than 100 arrests ranging all the way from East Harlem, a kind of revealing consumption spot, down into the Huallaga Valley. This really was the first modern cocaine bust. It sparked a brief flurry of international press about the drug. Time magazine in 1949, for example, dubbed cocaine Pichicata, Peru's white goddess, a kind of revealing, gendered and racial connotations. By the way, incidentally, this guy, Balareso, recently, it's one of these things that very rarely happens to historians. His granddaughter contacted me after she found this in the book. And she has very little contact with her family. And she wanted to know more and more about it. And we had these very interesting discussions about the great secrets of their family. All of this and his jail time were kind of kept from the family, most of whom who still reside here in the United States. Anyway, this was from 1949 to 1950. We then see an intense wave of repressive measures and missions, ranging from the new United Nations to Peru's own military, to wipe out this outbreak of illicit Andean cocaine and effectively end the older legal industry, in fact criminalizing and jailing most of its older leaders. But if this crackdown temporarily displaced cocaine from its Peruvian birthplace, these pressures also sparked a rapid dispersion of the techniques and knowledge about cocaine, especially to neighboring Bolivia, a country that had never experienced the so-called industrialization of coca. That's actually the term that's used historically and even today, had never experienced the industrialization of coca before. So what you're seeing here in the birthing of cocaine is what is also called, sort of in the drug literature, the ballooning effect. You crack down in one place and it quickly spreads to another place. And I even found a colorful set of documents by the FBN, that is the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was the predecessor of today's DEA, which claimed that Andres Soberon, who was Peru's most respected patriarch of legal cocaine, had become a kind of Juanito Coca seed of illicit drugs. That is, he had sent his technicians and his underlings to Bolivia to actually create an illicit cocaine industry, cottage industry there. I'm not sure that I actually believe these documents, but that's what the United States authorities were thinking at the time. So during the 1950s, cocaine gravitated from Peru, despite the kind of itinerant interest of Cuban mafiosos and the scattering of labs that you would see in Amazonia. Nor had Peruvian cocaine ever set out kind of social roots, that is, bring into play its own dynamics among coca-growing peasantry. And still, it still had been a phenomena that had kind of briefly lived off traditional Indian coca marts or cultures. Okay. Now, next I want to turn to another aspect of this, which are the international, well, the intermediate spaces or routes that developed during the 1950s and 1960s for cocaine. Mobile, long-distance drugs like cocaine need risk-taking intermediaries. They need pit stops, way stations, to bridge the tropical zones of production and cross safely borders to their areas of consumption. And during the 1950s, with the incentives that were hatched there in the Peruvian episode that I just described to you, you see the rise of this internationalist smuggling class, ever more professional, daring, better financed, and elusive than those kind of part-time sailors that were doing the job in the case of Peru in the 1940s. A group that began to actively promote both new centers and cultures of consumption in Havana, New York, and other Latin American cities, and linkages to supplies of, as we're going to see, Bolivian coca paste. Now, the first such area where intermediaries arose was in Chile, specifically northern Chile. Chile is not a country that is particularly known ever for drugs. But in fact, during the 1950s and 1960s, basically, Chile was the Colombia of cocaine. It was the first major entrepot that mobilized illicit cocaine across the hemisphere. And especially important in Chile was the very dynamic role of the Wasaf Harb clan. These were Turcos, which in Spanish America means people of Middle Eastern Arabic descent. They were from Valparaiso in the north. They were a very extended family with business and political connections in both Bolivia and even going up into the United States. And by the way, just as an aside, it's in the history of cocaine and also globally in the history of drugs, ethnic groups are often the pioneers in illicit drugs. In post-war Latin America, it was not only these Turcos who seemed to emerge almost everywhere in the story, but you also get a lot of Jewish refugees from Europe, and paradoxically at the same time, a lot of German refugees from Europe, some of whom I suspect were Nazi refugees. So there were a lot of very strange bedfellows in this story. Now, between 1950 and 1965, the Wasaf Harb clan perfected and intensified cocaine traffic north, despite a great deal of police attention and complicity in their far-flung networks. They pioneered this Bolivia, Chile, Mexico, New York route during this entire period, outflanking the only competitors that they had, who, as we're going to see, were the Cubans, who were coming away from a different direction. In the mid-1960s, under pressure from the United States, the Wasaf gang was broken up in a big international bust. But the result of that is that hundreds of other Chileans jumped into the fray, making Chile, by the late 1960s, the main cocaine corridor into the United States, and as it would be until the fall of democracy there in 1973. Now, Cuba, you all see Cuba there on the map, 90 miles from the United States, frightening to think of. Cuba has a more storied reputation for drugs, especially in the kind of corrupt and hedonistic ambiance of pre-revolutionary Havana, which was a meeting ground of international gangsters under the Prio Grau and Batista regimes of the 1950s. Now, what's striking in Cuba for me was the intense interest in cocaine by Cuban national mafiosos and merchants without any gringo gangster help. You know, there's all these famous stories about people like Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano in Cuba, but they had nothing whatsoever to do with the development of this cocaine trade. So I try to think of cocaine as a kind of a Cuban national project with men like Mendez Marfa, Martinez del Rey, the Fleifel family. You can notice from these names, some of them are also Turcos, in developing what was going to be their connection from Cuba to Bolivia for coca paste. So throughout the 1950s, you see labs popping up in Cuba for the refining and transshipment of this new Bolivian pasta básica de cocaína, which is a now kind of familiar international division of labor. And the Cubans had their own capital and their own retail circuits across the hemisphere. Moreover, Havana, with its kind of notorious sex and tourist clubs and industry, seemingly created the modern cultural taste for cocaine, which then spread outward. It was a very kind of pan-Latin outward. So I try to think of this as the Mambo period of cocaine. Actually, again, like I've said in other things, there's a great doctoral dissertation in there somewhere, the Mambo period of cocaine. Nonetheless, in 1959 to 61, Castro's dramatic leftist revolution marked a historic turning point in cocaine's evolution, as Fidel, who was no friend to capitalists or gangsters of any kind, expelled the new cocaine traders from Cuba, making this group even more and more dependent on this very mobile money-making activity of selling cocaine. And what this does essentially is it creates a second Pan-American diaspora of career traffickers, ranging now in the early 60s all the way from Argentina and Bolivia all the way into the heart of Miami, as you can guess. Now, U.S. authorities at the time disingenuously accused Castro of marketing cocaine, knowing completely well that it was exactly the opposite, that it was these right-wing exiles who were the real cocaine professionals coming out of Cuba at the time. In any case, the 1959 revolution in Cuba represented a new stage in the globalization and intensification of cocaine. Now, I'm going to shorten the story here a little bit, if I'm allowed to do that in my PBS allotment, and just mention, now that you have this pretty map up here, that beyond Chile and Cuba, there were also a lot of other, I would say, less central transshipment sites across Latin America, each of them which are fascinating in their own right. For example, Brazil. Brazil bordered Bolivia and Peru, but also there were very intense cocaine scenes in Brazilian cities, very kind of hedonistic. And many of you, this is kind of interesting because many of you, some of you may know that Brazil, again, today Brazil is the second largest consumer of cocaine in the world. Cocaine is really a big deal in Brazil today. Argentina had tango clubs, which had long been a locus of cocaine use, and mafias mafias that were very analogous to the U.S. mafia, ethnic mafias, who got involved in cocaine. Mexico was a constant transit point for these Chilean and Cuban cocaine traffickers who took advantage of the malleability of the Mexican government to traffic into the United States. Panama, stand up and be counted. Panama was always being watched because Panama was always kind of a crossing point of various types of traffic, including drugs. And Colombia during this period, that's the interesting thing. What's most fascinating to me about Colombia in this period is that Colombians were deeply involved in contraband trades of all kinds. It's a deep tradition in the country. And in the Santa Marta area of the north on the Caribbean, the marijuana trades were starting to flourish during the mid-60s to late 60s. But what's conspicuous for its absence is precisely the cocaine trade. The Colombians had not yet become interested. And anyway, in any case, all of these shifting channels of the 1950s and 60s where the new techniques and networks, alliances, and risk-evading strategies were being tried and perfected by this rising pan-American class of career cocaine traffickers. Okay. Now, finally, in terms of the geography here, I want to come to Bolivia right here. Because the real, and again, fairly unknown growth pole of cocaine in the 1950s, the incubator of illicit coca and cocaine together, was poor and chaotic revolutionary Bolivia. Some of you heard of this thing. Bolivia had this 1952 revolution. You have a historian of Latin America here. She should have been teaching you about that. Oh, okay, all right. You're still in the colonial times. All right, well, hurry up. Andean Bolivia has an ancient history with the coca leaf, which is grown in these hot yungas, it's called the yungas there, ravines. Actually, the first ones were very near the city of La Paz, and whose ritual use and workaday use is very well integrated throughout Bolivian society. Always has been and is even now today, including in the past the economic elites of Bolivia who grew it. Unlike Peru, though, coca never industrialized, that is, processed into cocaine, its coca for overseas or modern medical markets. Now, by 1952, you begin to see cocaine germinating in Bolivia by outsiders, mainly displaced Peruvians, Chilean clans that I talked about before, Cuban mafiosos, and Jewish and German refugees in the country. There's a great book that somebody wrote called Hotel Bolivia about the experience of these Jewish refugees who were there for a generation or so in the country. The revolution of 1952 opened the lid as Bolivia suffered an intense decade of disorganized authority, economic stress, peasant uprisings, and land reform, including new coca colonization in the vast Amazonian regions of Bolivia. You know, Bolivia's very regional. There's the Altiplano, colder regions, but more than half of the national territory are these very hot Amazonian regions of the country. Soon in La Paz and Cochabamba, you saw the eruption of dozens of small labs, and by the late 1950s, the rise of Bolivian national entrepreneurs. And the most amazing central figure here in Bolivia was the notorious, I'm going to use all these adjectives that you usually use with traffickers, and clever international trafficker Blanca Ibanez de Sanchez. And you have a DEA type photograph of her right there. Blanca, what do you think? Was that really her name, Blanca? That's like a trade name, right? She called herself, you know, white stuff. She sometimes went by the name Delicia, another trade name. She was not apprehended by U.S. authorities until 1965, despite operating a vibrant international cocaine trail from Bolivia through Havana into the streets of New York City. And just as another aside, women played a very large role in the first development of these illicit trades for a variety of reasons. Many of them began as mere mules, but they would rise up in the ladder like somebody like Blanca Ibanez de Sanchez. There's actually a historian in New York, Elaine Carey, do you know her work? Who's writing a book about these kind of pioneer women in the Latin American drug trades. Now, Bolivia also saw dramatic political drug scandals tainting revolutionary politicos, like the key leftist labor leader Juan Lechin in 1961, and most of these scandals linking to the revolutionary police chief Luis Garay, who happened to be a Chilean and a crony of the Wasaf Harb gang that I talked to about before. As in Cuba, the 1961 scandals were a turning point in Bolivian cocaine, as the United States, applying very intense pressure, finally got Bolivia to adopt anti-drug laws. Bolivia didn't really have any anti-drug laws up to this point, and to begin an anti-coca and cocaine crusade. However, the main effect of this during the early 1960s was to displace illicit cocaine from upland towns to inaccessible coca frontiers in lowland places like Santa Cruz, Amazonian Chapare. And in the process, during the early to mid-1960s, mobilizing a novel social force in the history of cocaine, which was illicit coca peasants. Thousands of coca peasants in lowland Bolivia who were tied to hundreds of new narcos selling to Cubans, Chileans, and beyond. So by 1964, and that's a good kind of marking point, Bolivia enters a kind of unstoppable phase of cocaine's growth. You see this in Interpol reports. By then, international police were all over the ground in Amazonian regions like this. And also, at the same time that it was happening in Bolivia in the mid-60s, its growth began to stimulate almost exactly the same growth of a illicit coca peasantry in the lowland areas back in Peru's Huallaga Valley, hundreds of miles away. Okay, well, let me try to end this somewhere. And in this talk, what I've been trying to do is bridge this historical gap, 1945 to 1965, between an era when nothing like illicit cocaine existed and the era of the rapid and inevitable escalation of its global traffic. And all of this before any interest of the Colombians who were to channel it and multiply it in the 1970s and beyond. Instead of fixed top-down cartel organizations, which is largely a myth anyway, and instead of outside mafia organizations, what you saw were hundreds of unknown, low-level, dispersed Peruvians, Bolivians, Cubans, Chileans, and others, relatively peacefully, forging a more and more regularized commodity chain, to use the sociological term, of cocaine with its own social base and own political dynamics. So the great empirical mystery remains, how and when did these more kind of ruthless and monopolizing Colombians enter and articulate with this more extensive circuits that had been developed during the 1950s and 1960s? But I'm not going to actually answer that question, unless you ask it in the question and answer period, because I want to end on two other more analytical points. Now, the first one, and this may perhaps seem obvious to people after the types of things that I've been talking about, is that the creation of this illicit sphere went hand in hand with the completion of a global system of prohibitions for cocaine pushed by the United States that finally in the 40s reaches the Andean homeland of coca, okay? This anti-cocaine campaign and a kind of secret war of the FBN that began in 1947 against South American smugglers sparked the growing skills and geographic compass of illicit cocaine traffickers. And in fact, in a larger kind of picture, and I'm not sure whether this will all make sense, but in a larger kind of structural picture, before 1945, there had existed a kind of loose, multipolar cocaine world. You had the coexistence of different types of legal regimes. Coca and cocaine were legal in many parts of the world without provoking any significant international traffic or social ills with the drug. Now, there were two notable milestone years in this kind of repression-expansion dynamic that I'm identifying. There's the conjuncture 1948 to 49. This was the year of Peru's militarized closure of the last legal factories of cocaine, of the UN's influential Andean Coca Study Mission, and motley US policing efforts to dam this tiny flow of cocaine north. Crackdowns that backfired into making the trade illicit and invisible instead. Another important milestone year is 1961. This is the year of the Single Convention Treaty of the UN, which finally put coca onto global prohibitions. The first US convened Pan-American cocaine police summits and the adoption of anti-drug campaigns in Bolivia. Now, obviously, the kind of cause and effect here is hard to kind of prove, though somebody might, if they studied these things in a more micro sense, be able to show exactly that cause and effect. But illicit cocaine ramps up visibly right after each of these repressive conjunctures, 1948 and 1961. Now, the second point of analysis, which may be related, is that this illicit movement was structured or channeled by political struggles around the escalating Cold War in Latin America, or around escalating Cold War tensions in Latin America. That is, cocaine was a kind of stepchild of the Cold War. Sometimes I've referred to it as a Cold War commodity. It's a different kind of political thesis than the kind of innumerable conspiracy theories that you probably hear about, about drug epidemics. You know, there's the conspiracy theory that says, oh, it was all the CIA did it. At the time, in the 1940s and 1950s, it was always about the communists. They're the ones that are planting drugs in our societies. And of course, we have our official conspiracy theory today, which is that these cartels are the ones that do it. Okay? Different political explanation than conspiracy theories. In a kind of a simplified scheme, 1947, the Cold War is born and quickly exported to Latin America. Same year that illicit cocaine is born. In the process of bringing Andean states in as US allies against communist phantoms and into a trumped-up anti-narcotics crusade as well. And the coincidence was very dramatic in Peru. The new communist campaign of General Odria's rightist military government in the country, which was against the Opera Party, which they portrayed as communist at the time, became very closely mixed with the novel pro-US war against local Amazonian cocaine. The military said this was a communist plot, cocaine. 1952, the Bolivian Revolution becomes a decade-long field of struggle between leftist nationalists and the meddling US and destroys the traditional state and order, and not coincidentally then becomes a cradle for the birth of this illicit coca and cocaine. 1959 to 1961 is a historic Cold War turning point. The Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution is really the climax of the Cold War tensions in Latin America from any angle that you look at it. And contrary to the propaganda, Fidel Castro quickly cleansed Cuba of the mafia including this nascent clique of cocaine capitalists, and their expulsion across the Americas defined a truly international career class of cocaine traffickers. Now, by the mid-1960s, what you see, and I'm going to very rapidly, you see a series of Cold War-inspired dictatorships in places like Brazil and Argentina, which closed the freewheeling drug corridors of the past, meaning that by the end of the 1960s, all exports of cocaine from South America were going through just one country, Chile. And 1973, and this is the virtually unknown but decisive climax of this process, an event happens which rapidly shifts the cocaine trade from Chile to its later destination, Colombia. And that event was the September 11th, 1973 Pinochet coup in Chile, infamously sponsored by the fanatical anti-communists Nixon and Kissinger, radically displaced cocaine's routing north, right into the hands of a new and daring class of Colombian entrepreneurs like Pablo Escobar and Carlos Lehder. So this is the political geography of post-war cocaine. It was midwived by these larger post-war political movements, both anti-drug and anti-communist. And if the United States definitively triumphed in the Cold War, in Latin America as elsewhere, these actions paradoxically birthed a continuing, unwinnable drug war, like today's kindred war on terror, a global war without end. And that's where I'm going to end.
You mentioned that the Bolivians started an anti-drug campaign. Was it against the users within Bolivia or the producers, or both?
This is in the early 1960s, 1961. It was mainly against the producers of illicit cocaine. During the 1950s, there had emerged this class of laboratories that were being linked to this international trade, and the Bolivians, with a lot of U.S. and aid from Interpol, began to crack down on these types of labs and types of traffickers. As yet, there was very little movement against mere indigenous coca users. In fact, that...
My question, did they go after the Indians who
No.
smoked it to survive?
No. That, in fact, although there began to be talk of that during the 1960s, that type of movement has never taken hold in Bolivia. Yeah.
I wonder if you could comment on the events of Panama circa 1989. It's like George Bush the First accused Manuel Noriega of being complicit in the cocaine trade. So he launched an attack against Panama, which it killed like hundreds of people in the small village called El Chorrillo.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, you're familiar with the cocaine traffic.
Yeah.
Do you think that what do you think really happened?
sounds a little bit like George Bush II. He attacked this small village called Baghdad looking for weapons of mass destruction that they never found. And we haven't quite explained that event yet either, right? Well, I mean, it's really out of the purvey of the time period that I'm dealing with here. No doubt Manuel Noriega was involved in narcotics trade, but he was involved in all kinds of things. And Manuel Noriega had been a close ally of the CIA and at times, and at other times he had been involved in guerrilla activities and business activities and illicit finance activities and whatnot. It was very complicated. I don't think really historians have gotten a good handle on why it is that George Bush I invaded Panama. Yeah, I mean, I'm looking to her because she is from Panama. I think it's one of those ineffable mysteries, like, you know, why do tornadoes always hit trailer parks, or why did we invade Iraq under George Bush II? It seems to have been some kind of personal vendetta between the Bush family and Noriega.
First of all, I apologize for being 15 minutes late. I was with a student. But I have maybe two questions. The first one's very simple. In Bolivia today, the coca leaf is still used as a tea. It's still used in a very innocuous, I guess you would say, way. Yeah. That's my first question. The second one, I don't know, this may be totally out of left field, but can you relate, like, the horrible things that are happening right now in Mexico, the really distressing drug wars that are going on in Mexico? Can you relate at all or comment on the trade that is causing this horror down there?
Yeah, I guess I could. I always get all these questions out of left field because people want to know just stuff about current drugs. First of all, coca leaf, you know, is very different from cocaine. Coca leaf is a pretty innocuous substance. It's like tea or coffee.
But people can't even bring that into the United States.
No, it's illegal in the United States for reasons that are beyond explication. It would be like drinking tea, but it's a custom that's very deeply ingrained in many ways, defining of indigenous identity in parts of the Andes. But more than that, in modern Bolivia, has actually become a defining commodity of modern Bolivia. So one of the most interesting developments of the past 20 years is, rather than denigrating the coca leaf and saying that coca leaf is just cocaine, there's been a counter-reaction to these aggressive US and UN policies against coca leaf. And in Bolivia, it's become an important part of the nationalist rhetoric of the country. We like coca. Coca is Bolivian. Coca is not a drug. These are the official. And so, yeah, it's used a lot. And it's used in new types of products like soaps and toothpaste and all kinds of things. And they want to break into the international market with these things, but they can't. Mexico, I recently put together a series of articles that I tried to peddle to the kind of more mainstream non-academic press, which I tried to show how the history of cocaine is related to the crisis that we face in Mexico today, or that Mexicans face in Mexico today, because it's really actually having very little impact across the border, despite the panic that we're having here. And basically what I tried to demonstrate is that if you look at this geography, what you're seeing is that the long-term impact of US intervention in the hemisphere has been to move the center of action of cocaine from the south to the north, closer and closer to the borders of the United States where most of the consumers are. And another aspect of this that has been quite disturbing is that progressive US actions have had the effect of making the cocaine trade move from being a rather innocuous smuggling operation to becoming something that's enveloped in tremendous violence, to this type of basically civil war that's happening now on the border with the United States. So there is a relationship. The most proximate cause is that during the 90s, the United States declared war on cocaine in one country, Colombia. And that became Plan Colombia later, where we funneled something like $6 billion into Colombia to fight drugs in Colombia. And some US officials say that Plan Colombia has been a success because there doesn't seem to be as much kind of street violence in Colombia today, or they're stretching if they say that drugs have declined in Colombia, because until last year there was not a single piece of evidence to show that cocaine production was declining in Colombia. But one direct impact of all this pressure against Colombia was to send the drug trade to Mexico. And that started in the mid-1990s, and these Mexican drug lords, who were already pretty well developed and had pretty close relationships with the Mexican state, became super billionaires, and they became major players in the international cocaine trade, because instead of from Colombia to Miami, the drug trade went from the Andes through northern Mexico. And so the impact of our policy with Colombia has been to create this huge crisis in Mexico today. So it's hard to imagine what our government officials are imagining next. You know, like, what will be the impact of cracking down in Mexico today? They haven't had much foresight up to this point.
Hi. What kind of living standards were small producers able, in like Bolivia in the 50s, able to sustain?
You mean from working in coca, or?
Yeah, from small producers of cocaine.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. I mean, you know, some of the characters who I'm describing to you, who are the kind of traffickers, some of them had pretty lavish lifestyles, but they weren't anything like what was going to come later in Colombia with, you know, these billionaires, you know, like Pablo Escobar. And there were no empires or huge concentrations of wealth like that. But, for example, Blanca Ibanez, the woman who I talked about, she kind of laundered her money, and she had a couple of hotels in La Paz, and she had, I think she had a laundry, ran a laundry where she laundered her money through a laundry. But you're not talking about super rich people.
No, I'm more interested in people who are just, peasants, I guess.
Well, peasants, this is one of the kind of things about the drug trade that's a little unclear to people. The peasants who get engaged in the drug trade are usually people who, for one reason or another, have been displaced into Amazonian regions. Like in the case of Bolivia, one of the major factors in the displacement of peasants was the closing down of mines in the 1950s and 1960s through restructuring and bankruptcy of state mines and whatnot. Or in the case of Peru, overcrowding and pushing out of haciendas and social movements pushed peasants down into these areas of the Amazon where coca could be grown. So for these guys, coca becomes a kind of survival strategy. No peasant has ever gotten rich growing coca. And that's actually one of the inequities of the international cocaine trade. It doesn't actually make the poor peasants who are growing coca and taking great personal risks in doing so, it doesn't make them wealthy. On the other hand, it's a much more profitable and ecologically suited crop, even though it's not a great crop for the Andean region, than any of the alternatives that have been found. Like, you know, like there are all these projects called alternative development, so citrus fruit or macadamia nuts, or there's never been found for the Andean region a source of livelihood for peasants who end up in these colonized jungle areas. That's not what the scenario has been so far. But the actual kind of return value to the producers of coca is very, very small in the cocaine trade. Most of the money, in fact, is made here in the United States. And that's kind of the ladder of the profits. The retail sector is really where most of the money is made in cocaine.
You just hit on it a little bit there. This is also the era, at least some of it, of the Alliance for Progress and these
Yes.
massive efforts to develop Latin America.
Yes.
And I was wondering if there were any official programs to incentivize alternative crops in the Amazonian region, or if there were concerns among these prohibitionists that things like extending roads into these remote areas might offer greater market opportunities for these producers.
Well, that's a fantastic question, because one of the major paradoxes of this era, the 60s and 70s, is that it was precisely US-sponsored modernization schemes in these three countries, Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia. Build roads into the jungle. That's the future. This will be the breadbasket of Peru. This will take the social tensions out of Bolivia. It was precisely those modernization projects that led to peasants in the jungle who began to have to turn to growing coca.
And these are government-sponsored, not corporate-sponsored?
Yes, these are government-sponsored projects, the Alliance for Progress, the Peruvian government, the Inter-American Development Bank, all of these. Usually what happened was that these projects ended. They lost interest in it. There came the crisis of the 70s and 80s, neoliberalism. So there were no more markets for these people. They were left behind out there in the jungle. And what were they supposed to do? There were no schools, there were no services, there were no crops. So they turned to drugs like coca. So it's really one of the most interesting paradoxes historically of this process. Now, I tried to answer myself this question of what were they thinking during this period. Well, one of the things was that there was this great ecological misunderstanding, which is very common in the mid-20th century, that the Amazon is somehow the future. The Amazon is not the future. The Amazon should have been just left alone. The Amazon is not a good agricultural area, right? Once you cut down these, we used to call them jungles, we call them what now? Rainforests. Once you cut down these rainforests, the only thing that is there, you can do some cattle raising, but it's really not a very they don't have great soils. I think many people here know that now. So what were they thinking? One of the most interesting things is that the Huallaga Valley, which is where illicit cocaine, where I studied it the most in my book, was also the center of the Western Hemisphere's largest tropical crop extension experiment. It was financed by the United States during World War II to try to create commercial, it was in Tinga Maria, which is a place that, if you know anything about the drug trade, became the capital of cocaine in the 1980s and is now returning to be the world capital of cocaine. And so that was where the United States set up this very large agricultural extension station. They brought all these scientists from the University of Wisconsin who knew all about agrarian breeding, blah, blah, blah. They put them there in the jungle and they said, teach the peasants to do something that is strategic and good for them. And that later became a national agrarian university in the case of Tinga Maria. But they were really drawing people down to the jungle, telling them, this is where you can actually earn a living. Not up there in that, you know, being a serf on that highland hacienda, not being a miner in some tin mine that's losing the Bolivian government, you know, millions of dollars a year. Go down to the jungle. And that's one of the reasons why we have, and the same process has worked out in the Putumayo region was the major colonization region for Colombia during the 1960s and 1970s. So it's it's interesting. Modernization failed, and what it led to was this drug trade. And the unifying commodity of the Eastern Andes is coca. There's no question about that.
Can we just take one more question? Well, you've told us about the government efforts and U.S. efforts to control this or stamp it out, and then the paradoxes. But I'm wondering, the drug people involved in the drug raising, drug moving, and so forth must be aware, very savvy about what's going on. Oh, look, they're doing this. That's an opportunity for us to turn it to our advantage in this way, I would think. But can you comment on something about how these drug cartels operate in this dynamic? Or,
well,
I shouldn't say cartels,
yeah,
but in the changing history, how they've sort of learned and developed knowledge.
Oh, that's interesting. There's a great book about that by a criminologist named Michael Kenny, and it's called From Pablo to Osama. And what he did is he studied the ways in which Colombian drug groups learn and adapted to repressive measures. And what he found out is that they were very actively learning, and that they learn much faster than authorities in the United States. And they adopt new technologies and new strategies years ahead. And so it creates this dynamic. It's kind of an ethnography of drug organizations in Colombia. But it's really about that, their adaptability and their learning curve. It's an amazing book. It's really the best book I've ever read on drug groups in Colombia. But Pablo Escobar was it Pablo Escobar or his brother? Pablo Escobar's brother has written a kind of a biography of Pablo, which I think was published in Colombia as Mi Hermano Pablo, right? Or it was a bestseller. Yeah, yeah. And it's actually a pretty good book. I mean, I'm not saying it's the best book that could ever be written about Pablo Escobar, but he reveals lots of details about how they emerged, which is one of the great missing stories. We don't really know how these Colombian organizations emerged, but I do remember one thing he said. He said, Pablo was always 2 or 3 years ahead of the DEA. They were so slow to catch up with everything that he did. But that sort of answers your question.